We ought to walk away from the negotiations in Vienna. How can you trust a regime that has just tried to kill your former national security advisor, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Army, Salman Rushdie, the woman in Brooklyn? How can you trust them?
Doesn't it come down to a classic foreign policy conundrum of engagement versus isolation?
Yeah, and in this case, we tried engagement, and we're now at a point where we're living Einstein's definition of insanity. We continue to repeat the same thing with the same awful result. Get up, leave the table.
What
do we do? Honestly, we got to say to ourselves honestly, this regime in Iran will never change. So our policy is to change the regime, support the people of Iran, and incidentally, that has to be coupled with exactly what General Wald, Ambassador, said, and John, which is, listen, to threaten, to try to kill John Bolton and the others, that's an act of war. I mean, we ought to make clear to the Iranian government that if they continue to do that kind of thing to our citizens, they're going to feel the strength and force of the American military on them in their country. And then we ought to stand with the people of Iran, including NCRI, which is the strongest resistance group, just as we stood with the citizens, the freedom fighters of the former Soviet Union, and hopefully with the same result. This regime cannot be changed. It has to be put into the dustbin of history. Ali Reza's NCRI's report in 2002, August, was jarring and riveting. And on Capitol Hill, it led to years of bipartisan support of essentially economic sanctions and other punitive acts against the Islamic Republic of Iran based on their development of what we took to be their clear development, though they denied it then and continue to deny it now in the face of overwhelming evidence, their commitment to develop nuclear weapons, let alone their support of terrorist organizations and the same. Thoroughly bipartisan all along. Until 2015-14, when the Obama administration joined with the so-called the others in the P5+1 to attempt to, based on a principle or a belief that somehow we could alter the behavior of the Iranian regime, and essentially in those negotiations, I'm speaking from personal perspective from Capitol Hill, they threw away the pressure that we had built up with these sanctions on a bipartisan basis over all those years for nothing. Basically, a pause at best.
Well, I think the Obama administration, in negotiating the deal in 2015, made a huge strategic mistake from the perspective of the United States. And you can talk about a lot of circumstances of the deal. You can talk about Iranian violations of the deal after it was enacted. The central part of the deal was to permit Iran to enrich uranium to reactor-grade levels, as if that is a constraint on their ability to get to weapons-grade uranium, when in fact enriching to reactor-grade does 70% of the work necessary to get to weapons-grade. People, I think, fundamentally don't understand this, including the American negotiators who cut the 2015 deal. Time is always on the side of the proliferator. Time spent in fruitless negotiations is time that allows the proliferator to overcome the enormous scientific and technological difficulties to perfect nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. Let's not leave that out of it, not covered by the 2015 deal, but obviously very important for Iran to have an effective delivery system. What we've seen in the past 17 months of the Biden administration is the pursuit not of a rational policy, but the pursuit of a holy grail of getting back into this program. It's not based on evidence, it's based on faith. And the consequence is that over 17 months, the United States has made further concessions that take a bad deal and make it worse. We hear about these concessions even now because although the European Union, I think for the second or third time, has said they've given Iran the final draft, the government in Tehran is starting to renegotiate it again on a number of things that are just unacceptable. And I will simply mention two quickly. One is that our own government has tried to make it harder for a future administration to get out of the deal by promising consequences that make Iran's nuclear program stronger if we withdraw. And now, apparently, reportedly, making concessions that the U.S. would pay damages to Iran if we ever withdrew again. Second, and obviously closely related, Tehran wants some kind of assurance that we won't get out of the deal. And one can only guess what the concessions are being made, have been made by the administration. So I just want to say one thing on that point. We have a large field, potentially, of candidates for the Republican nomination for president in 2024. Every single one of them believes that we should withdraw from the deal. So even if the administration goes back in, if there's a new administration in 2024, the deal will be over. And there won't be any damages paid to Iran if that happens. And I want to also say to the shareholders and boards of directors of not just American corporations, but especially European corporations, don't think you're going to make a profit worth it in the 2 years between this administration going back into the deal and another administration withdrawing from it. Whatever agreement the administration may be about to re-enter, you can count on the reality that Iran will not comply with it. It goes to the character of the regime itself. The administration is trying to compartmentalize the nuclear deal over here and Iran's support for terrorist activities over there. The two are two sides of the same coin, and there are many reasons not to re-enter the 2015 nuclear deal. This current threat of terrorism is just one more reason. And I think understanding the nature of the regime itself is critical to coming to a realistic American policy, which ultimately has to be, there's not going to be peace and security in the Middle East while this regime is still in power in Tehran.
Well, certainly the sensible support is not about arms or money or boots on the ground. It's actually the political support. But it starts with standing firm against the regime, because if they're trying to reach out to the regime, they will never look at the resistance. That's the story the past 40 years. Always investing on the regime. I think with the rise of Raisi at the helm, the message should be received in Washington and every capital in the world that this regime is in big trouble. Otherwise, Raisi would not have been put in that place. They are after the bomb as the only way for survival, the nuclear bomb. And any negotiations that is being done is actually feeding the Iranian regime. The best way to help the resistance, stand on their side politically, condemn every act the regime does against the people, against the protesters, and recognize their right to overthrow the regime. They have not recognized that.
And I think part of the problem in terms of not succeeding on the diplomatic front is that we have separated the military from the diplomatic, and I think that's a fundamental mistake. These are both tools. They're tools to achieve a specific objective. And if we say, well, the military is over here and we'll resort to that only if we fail on negotiations, that's not how you play this, okay? When you're dealing with a regime like the Iranian regime, and I had dealings with the Soviet Union. My first job was at NATO when we were introducing INF missiles, okay? How did we get to an arms control agreement? By deploying, by showing that we had a credible military option. I don't think we have, in the eyes of the Ayatollah, in the eyes of the mullahs, a credible military option. This administration is, I think, known for indecision and weakness. And with a regime like the one that we have in Tehran, that is an invitation. It's an invitation for them to continue to move forward with their nuclear program. We need to think about what happens if there is an agreement, okay? And I think we know the answer. We lift the sanctions, the regime is given tremendous resources, billions of dollars. What do they do with it? Well, they do the same thing that they did in 2015. They support terrorism, they build more missiles, they strengthen their nuclear program, they support Assad's government in Syria, and they repress the Iranian people. And I agree with the senator. I think the key here is the Iranian people. It is the clearest threat, the gravest threat to the administration. And at a minimum, we should not stand in the way of the people who seek democracy, basic human dignity, and human rights, okay? In terms of your question and how Iran would think about using a nuclear weapon, I don't think this is an issue of mutual assured destruction. I think when the Iranians think about it, they think about Libya, okay? They think about if they give up this weapon, and this is why they talk about it's critical for their survival.
The so-called Gaddafi example.
The Gaddafi example. Gaddafi gives up his nuclear weapons program, and then what happens? 8 years later, he's dead in a ditch, okay? What they want a nuclear weapon for, well, there are a number of reasons, but one reason is to prevent or to deter outside intervention if and when the people rise up. They want to avoid that situation that Gaddafi was caught in.
Some of the Europeans think in that way that, oh, well, if this becomes a problem, the United States of America will take care of it. We don't need to invest our efforts to that. I hope that Ukraine now has opened the eyes of the Europeans, since they are much more active. So I hope there will be a change.
By the way, the same negotiators that were there for the JCPOA are now back in negotiating. Wendy Sherman, for example, and her objective is to get an agreement, okay?
Jake Sullivan, a number of veterans of the earlier process.
No offense, I'm sure they're good Americans, but the fact of the matter is the objective is to say I succeeded with an agreement, not that I've had an agreement that's going to deter Iran from building a nuclear weapon. The IRGC needs to stay on the FTO list, period.
FTO
That's what they
meaning?
are, foreign terrorist list. Two, they need to, we in the negotiations, which Ambassador Bolton has talked about, need to put the ballistic missile issue back on the table big time and knock that off. Three, we need to start building and continue to build the coalition in the Middle East to defend against Iran. And four, we need to make sure they understand clearly we have a military option that if they keep going down this path, will be executed. Iran needs to realize there is an alternative to bad behavior. Last resort, but an alternative. We've been planning for that for 20 years, and it continues today. And obviously the Iranians play the game. There was an article this week in one of the papers that talked about the 20-year history of this, not necessarily Al-Arisa's part, but the different administrations that have been in power over the years. And I would kind of describe it as, this is the way I wish the world was, and this is the way we'll treat it, policy a little bit. And so what I'm saying is that great work on a lot of people's part, many of them sitting here, but there's no military alternative that Iran needs to know is there, and that's what we prepare for.